Hi guys and welcome back to Is It Worth It Reviews. Today we have something quite interesting, and that's this expensive Lampizator Baltic 3 DAC. And this one goes for almost 5,000 euros here in Europe, something like 4,800s, and $6,600 in US. But just at the beginning of this year, this model has been surpassed by the newer version, Baltic 4. And I don't have that one, I have no way to test it, but a kind friend loaned Baltic 3 to me, and I thought it would be really interesting to see what a 5,000 euros or like $6,500 DAC can offer. How does it sound? How does it compare to things that I usually review here at this channel that are at least like 3 times cheaper or more usually? So let's dig in and find out. So starting with the DAC specs, it's not something that is the focus of this DAC. The thing that we do know is that it uses Delta Sigma DAC in the heart of it. It does support all new formats and high resolutions, but the exact model of the chip being used is not known. It is known that it is Delta Sigma, so it's not based on some R2R design, like I think some Lampizators were based on R2R designs, but this one is not. It's Delta Sigma chip inside. But in this case, that's not all that important, because if you imagine like a typical Delta Sigma sound, this is not it. Because the output stage uses tubes for amplifying the signal coming from that DAC chip and outputting it to your preamp or integrated amp. And that makes a lot of difference compared to like your traditional, more affordable Delta Sigma DAC that uses op amps in the output stage. How much of a difference, we'll talk about that just a little bit later. Now, when it comes to digital inputs, you have a selection of USB, coaxial, optical, and AES EBU in digital input. So you have 4 inputs and no I2S, and on the side of the analog outputs we have both single-ended RCAs and balanced XLRs. Now this DAC is Spartan in its design. It doesn't have LCD, it doesn't have a remote control, it doesn't have adjustable variable outputs. I think that the latest Baltic 4 offers that option in form of variable outputs with analog control, but this one is purely a DAC with fixed outputs. It has one button in front that lets you select either USB input or other 3 inputs. And when other 3 inputs are selected, then you have a selector in the back of the unit that you can choose between optical, a coaxial, or AES EBU. And then even more interesting that in the back we have a gain selector switch. But I'll tell you that some preamps and amps will not tolerate that high of a voltage on the output of this DAC. Both me and a friend that loaned me this unit, we had experience with preamps that could not accept high output without getting into the distortion. Clipping basically. In that case you can use low gain mode. My personal preamp that I used for the most of this test, Acoustic Invader Fulcrum, has no problem with high voltage, and I actually even think that high voltage sounded a little bit more energetic and just more engaging. And the creator of Lampizators, I think he says something like that too, that he actually prefers high gain output if your preamp can accept it. Now moving to the tubes, this being a balanced DAC, it has total of 5 tubes in its circuitry. And I'll put those on the screen. And in this particular case, I had this unit loaned to me with these like old NOS tubes. I don't think they're anything fancy or really expensive, but these old NOS tubes are usually really good even if they're not fancy and too expensive. And only one last comment is about its finish and looks. The front panel is a really thick aluminum plate, and the upper and side sheets are made from like quite thin metal. It's nothing premium really. And I noticed a funny thing when ordering this DAC on the website. you can opt out for like plain black version, and that's the price that I mentioned. But you can choose the chassis made out of copper, and that's like 1,000 euros more expensive. But then you can choose it to be like normal metal, but with a coppery looking finish, like this unit is. And I really like the combination of black front and this copper colored chassis behind it. I think it looks really cool, especially with the orange amber glow of these tubes. But this finish is 200 euros or dollars more expensive than the black one. I think that's bollocks, because you know, paint doesn't cost 200 US dollars, but yeah, these expensive brands do these things. Like for the regular price, you get the plain version. But if you want just a slightly different color, pay up, baby, because you can. You're buying like 6,500 US dollars DAC. You can pay 200 more for like cool coppery color. Just relax and pay and be cooler than the owners of the regular plain version. And you know, nah. Aesthetics and pricing out of the way, how does Lampizator Baltic 3 actually sound? I'm sorry to say, it actually sounds pretty darn good. More than good, it sounds really great. Because, why am I sorry to say this? Because I love having more and paying less for it. And I would love the idea of more affordable DACs that I reviewed on this channel being completely equal and offering the exact same sound fidelity as this Baltic 3 does. But that's not the case, I'm sorry to say, because this thing sounds amazing. First thing that you notice is how freaking rich and lush with tone timbre it sounds. Now, things like tone texture and tone body, that tone timbre, that's really rich and lush, that you cannot not notice that. But it's not only about that tone richness, the sound staging is also phenomenal. And that's especially interesting because we are talking about the Delta Sigma DAC chip inside, in the heart of this DAC. But the sound staging is actually quite comparable to R2R DACs, because of the tube output stage and the topology and everything that the designer of the Lampizator is doing for the last I don't know how many years, but he knows his stuff. And this sounds amazing. The sound stage is really deep, it's wide, and it's tall. It feels freaking airy, and it's just filling the space not only in between my speakers but behind them and also left and right of them. It's filling that space with thick, rich tones, with plenty of details, and that thick atmosphere and airiness between the tones. Now, don't get me wrong, this separates really nicely. All of the musicians are arranged with great skill. If you have something in the back, it's in the back. If it's up front, it's up front. Left, right, empty space around those and between them. But all those instruments and vocals feel super-sized compared to the average DAC. It's just like having a smaller screen and then expanding it to a huge screen without actually losing resolution and detailing. If anything, like mid-range resolution, that inner tone detailing and texturing, and then those quick transients, all of that is retrieved in a great way, and this DAC actually sounds huge and really revealing at the same time. In terms of how it renders those details, it's actually completely in pair with how R2R DACs sound very natural, very revealing, but actually never over-sharpened, never analytical. And if you maybe thought that that kind of sound could be achieved only with an R2R DAC, I have to say, no, it can actually be achieved with a Delta Sigma DAC in the right kind of topology and the output stage. But to completely assess how good it actually is, and it is really, really good, I'll do 3 comparisons. And the first one will be with people's champion, Gustard R26. Now, R26 is a fantastic R2R DAC that sounds clean and really deep and spacious, but when pitted directly against Baltic 3, Baltic 3 actually sounds even wider and even taller. In terms of depth, Baltic 3 is not really better because Gustard R26 has really insanely great sound staging in terms of depth, but basically in all other aspects, including that, with the sensation of height, tones and vocals being more realistic in space and even bigger, like everything just grew in most directions, except depth, as I said. And in the process, Baltic 3 is more incisive. Just hearing how rich some tones sound, how many inner tone details they have, how many things are actually happening when you do something on some sort of acoustic instrument, like classical guitar. You can just see that that's a complex instrument that has its chamber, that has a neck, that has strings, and those are vibrating, and those small vibrations are not always perfectly straight. They're resonating and breathing a little bit, and all of that richness of one seemingly simple tone, like just one pluck of a string, is revealed better with Baltic 3 than it is with Gustard R26. And then when you put that kind of richness and expressive, expansive sound into all of the instruments and vocals and everything happening in the recording, R26 sounds a little bit closed in and almost a little bit cleaned out. I don't want to say simplistic, but in a way it does a little bit compared to Baltic 3. Now, this doesn't really say anything bad about Gustard R26 that is more than 4 times, or yeah, it's about 4 times cheaper than Baltic 3. And of course, it sounds better than that quarter of a price would suggest. It's not nearly as big of a gap in terms of sound as it is in terms of price. But that's something that I came to expect, and all of us that are in this hobby for some time. Baltic 3 doesn't sound 4 times better than Gustard R26. That just doesn't happen, but it is noticeably better. It's not like you have to have bad ears and you have to be a crazy audiophile. No, like almost everybody in a really good system, when you switch between these two DACs, will immediately notice how richer, wider, bigger, and just more vibrant Baltic 3 sounds compared to Gustard R26. Now, the next DAC that I had a chance to compare directly with Baltic 3, and that happened in my friend's system that's basically almost the same as my own. We have same speakers, same preamps, same amps. He is actually using a Lampizator Baltic 3, unlike me, on a regular basis, but the rest of the system is basically the same. And in his place, he had an Acoustic Invader Lancer DAC. And if I'm not mistaken, that DAC is somewhere around 5,000 to 6,000 euros, which puts it in the same league as Lampizator Baltic 3. Now, first thing that you notice comparing these is that Acoustic Invader DAC sounds narrower, but it does have much more focused and energetic delivery when it comes to edges. That's definitely not something that you would describe like analog-like, the way you do describe how Lampizator sounds or how R2R DACs sound. This is a typical, great, but typical Delta Sigma DAC. With great clarity, great dark background. It also has pretty good soundstage depth, but the overall width and height are not comparable to Lampizator. Also, inner tone texture feels richer with Lampizator too. But one thing was noticeable in that comparison, and that's that Acoustic Invader DAC had better dynamics. It was more punchy. It sounded bolder when it kicks. And that was especially noticeable with the bass line that was more focused and kicked with such intensity that it made Baltic 3 sound soft and a little bubbly in comparison. That's something that you simply cannot notice when you compare Baltic 3 with these great but more affordable DACs such as Gustard R26 or Leather Schumann, etc. You just don't notice that it's better than them in terms of dynamics and bass control, but when you compare it to that Acoustic Invader Lancer, you notice how actually insanely dynamic and focused can that DAC sound, especially with the bass line. But there was like 3 or 4 friends that evening when we compared these two, and we all noticed those differences, but I think that almost all of us, probably all of us, agreed that we would personally rather listen to Lampizator Baltic 3 in our own systems, because of that effortless richness and naturalness, the sound that resembles to the best turntables that I've ever heard in my life. And if you never heard a really, really great turntable, you don't know what that technology can do. Don't talk shit about it just because you watched some numbers and you see that digital equipment can do higher dynamic range. Like most recordings anyways do not have dynamic range bigger than like 15 dB. Hell, most pop songs do not have dynamic range that exceeds 5 dB. It's insane. So like no real life recording will exceed the dynamic range of a good turntable. We can talk about 120 dB of dynamic range in some DACs, but you're never going to experience that. That's just for bragging on paper. So back to Baltic 3, it sounds as a really, really good turntable. And technically speaking, Acoustic Invader Lancer does some things better. Especially that dynamic, that punch, that crazy energy and focus, the intensity and drive behind those notes, but it does it in a narrower and more analytical way, and we were all like, yeah, we're okay with sacrificing that and taking what Lampizator Baltic 3 is doing great. And then my last comparison, that for most of you will basically mean nothing, but I know that some of you would ask me about this, is with my own do-it-yourself DAC. I'll put the image of it on the screen, which is funnily enough based on the old design of the creator of all Lampizators. And that one is called Lampucera. It's like Italian name. I don't really like it, but yeah, what can you do? And it is also a DAC that has a tube in its output stage. But this one is much simpler. And it's a simpler design. It doesn't have USB input, only coaxial and optical. You can make it to have an USB input if you want. I didn't do that. I also decided to make only single-ended version because making it balanced would be much more expensive and I would need much bigger casing. Also, what I did with that do-it-yourself DAC is that I went crazy and overbuilt it. Instead of using one linear power supply, I used 3. One for the digital section, one for the tube heater, and one for the output stage. Even Baltic 3 doesn't do that. And on the output stage, I used Miflex copper foil capacitors, and like wiring is really, really good. It's monocrystalline copper and silver, depending on the position. Then I used the Furutec AC inlet socket and Furutec output RCA sockets, and it's just overbuilt completely. And that DAC that I built is actually completely matching Baltic 3 in terms of how rich and full and big and lush it sounds, but it has some small differences. For example, one of them is that my DAC sounds darker up top. A Baltic 3 is a little bit airier and a little bit more open in the highs. And that's okay because I almost deliberately aimed by choosing such components to make my DAC a little bit darker. Maybe I overshot a little bit, but I know how to deal with that. It's not a problem. I will very soon make an attempt to make it a little bit more open in highs. Everything else, like mid-range and richness and inner tone texture and just how big and wide and deep it sounds, is comparable. Actually, my own do-it-yourself DAC has a little bit deeper sound staging and darker background compared to Baltic 3. And the last difference is that Baltic 3 is actually not as dynamic and authoritative and punchy in the bass line and mid-bass as my own DAC. My own DAC has much greater punch and like dynamic swings and authority with the bass. Baltic 3 sounds a little bit mild and softer and dynamically compressed compared to that. It's not a huge difference and you cannot notice it in every song. For example, if I play something with vocals and like nice acoustic instruments like this, you don't notice that. In this song, I actually slightly preferred Baltic 3 because of its airier, more open top. But if I then play something that's energetic and engaging, like this song for example, then my own DAC sounds much more engaging and dynamic and authoritative compared to milder and dynamically flatter Baltic 3. And I don't want to bother you with this that much. I'll talk about my own DAC in a separate video. What I wanted to say here in this video is that how cool that actually is. The designer of Lampizators, he made that do-it-yourself topology and everything, and he made it public on his web page, on the Lampizator website. And he has to have thumbs up from all of us for being that cool. That would be all about that. I'll talk about that do-it-yourself project a little bit more in a separate video. For now, I want to bring this one to conclusion. Lampizator Baltic 3. I have to say, this is one really, really great sounding DAC. Now, the pricing and if that's reasonable, I leave that to you. I don't know. Especially if you're choosing any other color than black one and you have to pay a little bit more. Yeah, that would be really funny in my opinion. But, you know, it's the world we live in. People who know how to create something exceptional, you know, they want a return. The designer of Lampizator, he talked for such a long time on different forums on the web. He gave his ideas freely. He's still giving his early ideas freely. He's not disclosing these latest designs that he's using. But yeah, I cannot tell you how good of a value this DAC is because I'm not comfortable reviewing such expensive products. But given my experience with so many more affordable DACs, I have never encountered one that sounded this good. So every time somebody tells you that a certain DAC is a giant killer, it's kind of limited expression. If there is a DAC currently on the market that's like $1,000 and it sounds as good as a 2 years older DAC that's $2,000, I would call that a giant killer. Damn, that's a really good product. It brought performance that was double the price 2 years ago to half the price nowadays. And I don't know, I'm somewhere between 50 and 100 DACs tested. None of those could challenge what Lampizator Baltic 3 is doing. Yeah, that has its price if you don't know how to make your own. And with that, I hope you like this video. Maybe you learned something. Maybe you'll be disappointed because I didn't find out that some cheaper DACs sound exactly as good as this one. But what can I say? That's life. And with that, thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.